Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all well. Welcome to the Competitor's Ultimate Guide to Performing Under Pressure, Part 2. So this is the second part to Performing Under Pressure. So hopefully you've either watched the Part 1 live, or you've watched the recording, which is on Motorsport UK's website. We've got guest speaker John Pratt from iZone Driver Performance, and my name's Katie Baldwin, and I'm from Motorsport UK. And as with previous webinars, I'm mainly here to monitor the Q&A and field any questions for John at the end. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping points as usual. Please be aware that the webinar is being recorded. It will be available afterwards on the Motorsport UK website. So if you miss anything, you can revisit the session, and that should be up by the end of the week. You guys are all on mute, but if you'd like to ask any questions, there's a Q&A function that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to ask any questions, please post them on there, and they'll either be answered naturally through the presentation or when John pauses to take questions at the end. That's all from me for now. So enjoy the session, and I'll now hand over to John.
Thank you, Katie. So this is part 3 of our trilogy on performing under pressure. So in my first talk, I discussed the challenges associated with performing under pressure, and we looked at 3 key areas that we need to address if we want to become robust under pressure. The first one is very important. It's understanding what happens to your mind when pressure comes on. And we use an example of a teammate being quicker than us. And remember, in this situation, it's your ego that's threatened, the picture you build up about yourself. And this activates the ancient fight and flight response that has been within us built up over 100,000 years, and is designed to protect us. And this in turn leads to emotionally driven decisions, not logic. And as a result, in motor racing, you're being caught by your teammate. What are we going to do? We want to escape that as quickly as possible, and we start to push immediately. And for us as drivers, it generally means we'll start guessing and being hopeful about our braking. Or you could become cautious. You started making mistakes as a result, and we actually end up underdriving. And so with understanding, you learn that you're not alone or different from anyone else. That's the first thing, is when we're experiencing pressure and making mistakes, we think it's just us. No, you're just joining the club. We all suffer. And that these negative mental processes are actually really part of being a human being. And everyone in different walks of life and in different situations will face the same thing. So secondly, you have to train and condition your mind to build mental strength and resilience. And in the last talk, Sid, our performance psychologist and trained mindfulness coach, explained the principles that lie behind mindfulness and how you can use this practice to minimize distractions and negative thoughts, to redirect your mind to the task in hand. And obviously that is really critical when pressure comes on. Okay. And finally, the importance of building your method. Your method is how you perform at your best, technically and mentally. It's effectively your current skill level plus your current experience. And when pressure comes on, it is your method that you take into battle with you. It's the foundation on which everything is built, and it needs to be deeply embedded through constant practice so that when pressure does come on, it doesn't get blown over. Okay. And when you're on track, your method should be your primary task in hand. And that's what we'll talk about task in hand later. But your method can also be called your B game. And so how do we build this method and our B game? Well, first of all, there are four things we need to look at. Firstly, we need to understand the difference between your A game and your B game, and how they are inextricably connected, and how important they are for us in motor racing. Second thing is understanding how to use training and practice to learn about and how to build this B game. Third, learning how constant repetition and reinforcement of your B game leads to retention of skills and helps solidify this method. And finally, we need to learn how to make your B game your primary task in hand when you're on track. So your A and your B game. So your A game is you performing at your individual best. You're focused completely on your process with no distractions. And as a result, and this can happen in testing, in racing, rarely would happen in a short sort of qualifying session, but certainly in longer runs, you'll find yourself starting to drop into a state of hyper concentration, known as probably more familiarly known as the zone or flow state, where you find yourself driving unconsciously as if you're on autopilot, which in fact you are. You're not thinking where to brake, how to brake, where to turn, or where to pick up the throttle. You find yourself more observing your driving. You're just witnessing what's happening with no judgment of yourself or interference with the process. And you realize that you're performing at a higher level. Time is coming to you. You're not chasing it. You're using less physical and mental effort. You're not making mistakes, or certainly not big mistakes. You're driving more instinctively. You're naturally adaptive to changing handling and track conditions. You don't really think about it. Your reactions are faster. And this is because they're no longer at this stage filtered by your conscious or your thinking mind. And most importantly, for those of you who've experienced this, it's enjoyable. And but the challenge is you don't generally, there's sort of gradations of the zone. You know, you can be very deeply in it, or you can just touch it. And you generally only know you've been deeply in the zone when it's over. And the deep experience of the zone is quite rare. And there's a very famous example of being deeply in the zone that was given by Ayrton Senna, or should I say that Ayrton Senna experienced in the 1988 Monaco Grand Prix. And there's lots of stories you can look up on the web about this, and there's also various movies on various videos on YouTube as well. It's quite fascinating. And so this is just to read how he reported it. Okay. Suddenly, I realized I was no longer driving the car consciously. I was driving it by a kind of instinct. Only I was in a different dimension, well beyond my conscious understanding. And the critical thing there is conscious understanding. I was on pole position already. At first, half a second, then a second, and I just carried on going faster and faster. In a short time, I was 2 seconds quicker than anyone else. And remember, his teammate at that time was the great Alain Prost, believed to be one of the greatest drivers ever. So this is a significant difference. It was like I was in a tunnel, not only in a tunnel under the hotel, but the same track was a tunnel to me, and I was passing through it, touching on the sides. I simply drove and kept on driving faster, faster, and faster. So I think that's a sort of a fascinating story and a brilliant example of being in the zone, and from our point of view, from being in or on, absolutely on what we could call his A game. It is important, one thing about the zone before I go on, it's actually not dependent on ultimate skill level. You can still experience the zone with poor technique. It's basically what's drawn on is your most practiced technique that you use when you're experiencing the zone. So how do you access your A game? Okay, if this is critical. First of all, you cannot go out with the intention of driving like Senna and just, oh, let's be in the zone today. The zone cannot be chased down consciously, as it is a product of the unconscious mind, the non-thinking mind. It can only be attracted, and the way you attract the zone is by concentrating on your B game. Okay. As explained previously, your B game is essentially your individual process of driving. How you operate, the three things that make a difference, to your performance in motor racing. That's the steering wheel, the brake, and the throttle. How you operate those those three things is your method. How you drive a racing car. It's the technique you have practiced the most. The sum total of the neural pathways that you have built up through purposeful practice. This method should have been tested over and over again under a pressure in training to ensure that it is robust. If your B game is robust and you focus intently on this method and you direct your task in hand to the most important task at that time with no distraction or doubts, your driving will naturally start to flow and you'll begin to touch the zone. You have to trust that it will happen and stay with the process, being with what is happening in the moment as the corners and laps begin to unfold in front of you. So we absolutely can't just decide to be in it. We have to really, really focus intently on our B game. And if the gods are with us, we'll start to experience the zone. So if you're lucky enough to be on your A game during a whole weekend, all is well and good. Make sure you enjoy it. And most importantly, understand what conditions contributed to it, because this is absolutely a far from regular occurrence. Alternatively, you could have a weekend where you struggled. You couldn't find your rhythm in free practice, for example. You made a mistake maybe on your first flying lap in qualifying, and that affected your whole session. Or your teammate, for once, was on his or her A game, and you felt under pressure. This is actually much, much more likely to happen than a good weekend. And this is where you need your B game stepping up to the plate. So it's pretty much all of the time we are focusing on our B game with the hope that if we do it well, we'll touch our A game. That's really how it works. The best drivers in the world don't always access their A game, but they are always able to access their B game in the most challenging of situations. And this is where their confidence and their self-belief resides. In adversity, your B game should be able to salvage a second row if you can't make pole. So if you're quick enough to be on pole, but you just don't quite put it all together, your B game should take over, and hopefully you'll salvage a second row position. And this is sort of fun. This is how the pros win championships. But the challenge is, if you're unable to access your B game, you can end up on the third or the fourth row. So this is why the B game is so important to us. It's important to recognize this is not a technical skill issue, it's a mental skill issue. When drivers can't access their B game under pressure, what happens is that they completely lose faith in their method, whatever that might be. And this then leads them to start trying things they've not done before in a desperate attempt to get out of this hole and drive quickly. And invariably for us as drivers, we know it starts with guessing at our braking. That's the easiest thing to do. Or could be carrying more speed or picking up the throttle early, but it's more in hope than judgment. And this is effectively classic overdriving, which if it continues leads to frustration and further drops in performance. But remember, as we talked about in my first talk, this whole process is being driven by that fight and flight instinct and that urgency of getting out of it as quickly as possible. So if your B game is so fundamental, how are we going to build it? And obviously this is through training and practice. And there's a very famous quote that I love, and we have it up on our wall here at iZone. When you are not practicing, remember someone somewhere is practicing, and when you meet them in competition, they will beat you. So how are you going to beat this guy or girl when they are training effectively and relentlessly? And for a fact, they're out there. There are some people in the sport who absolutely grind it out. And the only way we're going to be able to do this is by, if they're training effectively, we've got to be training effectively ourselves. And to do this, we need to start at the fundamentals. You need to know what your goals are. Training requires effort, commitment, and sacrifice. Unless your goals are really powerful and you know what you're going to get when you achieve them, and that's really what you want in your life, you almost certainly won't do the work required. Okay, so absolutely, you need to know. I always say to my drivers, why are you here? What are you doing? What's important to you? And very important before you get in your car, why are we here? What am I about to do? What does it mean to me? But that certainly in training is very important to us, and it'll drive everything we do. Once you've got your goal, you need to know where your skills lie in relation to that goal. What are you good at? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? These are your opportunities and potentially your future strengths. So once we've got our goals, to support and to achieve our goals, we've got to know where we are now. And once we know where we are, we can then create training goals to work on the areas that we need to maintain. Whatever we're strong in, we need to make sure we maintain that. And areas where we are weak, we need to make sure we're working on those. And this gives structure. And then from our goals, we need to have a program of when we're going to do this training and how we're going to do it. And this gives structure to what you're doing and ensures that we're focusing on the big wins every day, not the fun things to do. Remember, human beings don't like the tough things. It's not within our nature. We don't always choose to do the difficult things first. And it's very easy. The human will always choose the easy way out. So it's absolutely fundamental. If we don't have a training program and a training goals, it'll be very easy for us to work on the things that actually come easy to us, not necessarily the things that will make the biggest difference to our careers or to our results or whatever. So the program you create then needs to be, you need to make sure it's focused on perfect technique. This is obvious. I know I said earlier that the zone doesn't require perfect technique. That's true, but we certainly don't want to. If we're training and we're training hard and we want to achieve goals, we've got to make sure we are training perfect technique all of the time. It's got to be structured constantly, as I was saying before. Identify and working on the areas with the biggest return, cutting the heads off the biggest snakes in the basket first. It's got to be disciplined. Motivation should have no place in training, because motivation, some days you're motivated to train, some days you're not. training is about discipline. If it needs to get done, if it's in your program, it gets done no matter how you feel. And remember, and this is very important, every decision you make about your training is going to create your future. Every single decision you make. It's got to be purposeful. You've got to be working in a constant struggle, pushing limits and reaching for what is just outside of your grasp, at the outer edges of what could be called your flight envelope. You can never be making excuses. You can never hide from competition, never protecting yourself, and never allowing yourself to give up. You've got to be intense and focused. Every single day training at the same level of intensity that you'll be competing at. And this is critical. Too many drivers I see here will have a sort of training mode or a practice mode, and that doesn't relate to the intensity that's required for qualifying, which is the most important part of any weekend. And you'll see with any of the fight sports, certainly no boxer would train at an intensity level that is anywhere below the intensity they need to fight at. Otherwise, round one, they're going to be very quickly looking up at the lights. Has to be assessed and recorded. If we're creating training goals and a training program, we should be recording everything we do so that we are constantly benchmarking ourselves, seeing how we're improving. And this helps us learn fast and retain that learning. We can see the things that we're doing that are working and the things that are not, and we can refine our program. And finally, not practicing until you get it right. That's a fallacy of training. You have to be practicing until you can't get it wrong anymore. Okay, so how does training work? Well, it works through repetition, reinforcement, and retention. And these are known as the 3 R's of training. Repetition involves repeating techniques or skills, exercises and drills. Reinforcement means repeating your training and drills in different ways, and I'll explain that in why we do that in a moment. And retention is the end result of repetition and reinforcement. So let's look at those 3 separately. So repetition. We are what we repeatedly do is a well-known quote. By repeating the same skills, exercises, and drills over and over again, reading about them, seeing them, and hearing about them multiple times will increase your understanding and retention. And obviously, I'll just add in here, to be able to do this study, to have this commitment, and to learn about yourself, learn about your sport, learn about skills, you have to have a fascination with building this method. You've got to be completely absorbed in learning about your sport, be absolutely fascinated by it. And that's what the top athletes are. They're fascinated with it. And you've only got to look at how they practice their routines, their workouts, their skills 1 million times over in training, especially before big competitions. So repetition is something that is essential to all sport, to all learning. And it's something that I don't know if you realize that kids love it. For those of you who've got children, we know the desire for repetition is sort of innate in all of us from a young age. Children love to repeat the same games and the same stories. And the word again is something that I'm certainly really familiar with when my son was young. So repetition is something that's inbuilt within us and absolutely at the core of training. And repetition isn't always enjoyable. You will be repeating very boring, sometimes very boring drills. So that's repetition. Reinforcement. What are we reinforcing? As a racing driver, and we come back to it, we are reinforcing our B game or our method. And really those 2 words are interchangeable. And the more you can vary your training and apply stress to your skills, the broader and more robust your skill base will become. It also adds a bit more interest to your training. And this in turn makes it much more difficult, the broader your skill base, much more difficult for the winds of pressure and change to blow it over, to blow your method over. So that's repetition and reinforcement, and that leads to retention. So let's have a look at what retention is. When you learn a new skill, your brain creates new neural pathways, and repetition reinforces these pathways. The more we repeat a skill and the more we vary and apply pressure to a skill, the deeper these neural pathways become. So what role do neural pathways have in training? So this is important. There are many skills that racing drivers need to learn to do automatically, or we could say unconsciously. And this can only be done by practicing the same thing over and over again. This practice gradually builds neural pathways, which are effectively high-speed links in the brain, which in turn develop something you're probably more familiar with, the term muscle memory. And once a certain skill has been practiced enough times, it is said to be programmed and is then strongly retained. Okay. So the first time a driver learns a new technique, you have to work hard consciously at it to execute it. And all of this effort makes the new technique feel awkward and unnatural the first few times it's tried. That's because there are no neural pathways to support that. There's no muscle memory to support it. A driver who continues learning the new skill or practicing or refining an existing one builds new or stronger neural pathways. And this helps the technique to become an unconscious and automatic action. And crucially for us as drivers, this means that the more often techniques are practiced, the more likely it is that those skills can be executed or drawn on when needed under pressure. So when a technique can be executed, so initially when we're learning a skill, it's known as a technique. So it could be a braking technique, a line technique, or throttle technique, vision technique. Is something that we're learning to do. But once it's been practiced over and over again, repeated, and it starts to become automatic and can then be executed under pressure, is known as a skill. Okay, so until a technique can be performed under pressure consistently, it can't be called a skill. Okay, so there are good and bad neural pathways. When practicing and building your neural pathways, it's essential that the muscle memory being built up is created using the correct technique. It is a complete waste of time to practice driving the wrong way. This is how bad habits and bad technique are created, and then they're ingrained in our unconscious. And when something has been learned the wrong way, this incorrect muscle memory has to then be overwritten, and new neural pathways then have to be built up to replace it. And they can get in a bit of a competition, as this can take a long time. Remember, under pressure, you will revert back to your most practiced technique. And this is why at iZone, we make sure that drivers all have a sort of driver assessment form with various criteria that apply to them that they have to score, to ensure that they keep to the exact process that is appropriate to them. So skills can't drop away, and new skills that we're learning, we can see how they're developing. And without this check on us, the pressure to perform, even in training, even in practice, driven by lap time focus or what we call outcome, can mean that the correct process can be allowed to lapse as drivers just start to try harder, with the result that they end up practicing incorrect technique, which can then become retained, which is what we don't want. This means that if you chase time on the brakes and overdrive in training, you are very likely, if not guaranteed, to do this in qualifying, all to the benefit of your competitors. And it's interesting, a couple of days ago, I had a driver in for the first time, and one of the issues he was having was struggling in qualifying, and it was rated, actually, he would exceed track limits a lot in qualifying. And as soon as we went on the simulator and he did a warm-up session, it was obvious from the start that he exceeded track limits in his practice on his home sim at home. And so obviously, when pressure comes on, he's going to exceed track limits. Okay, good thing about neural pathways is once we've built them up, they're permanent and they don't go away. Once a strong set of neural pathways are built in the brain for a specific action or set of actions, the technique will come back with ease, even if it hasn't been used for years, since the memory is safely stored away in your unconscious. Okay. So having built your method and practiced it over and over again, including repeatedly under pressure, how do you use this method over a race weekend, and where do we direct it? So, to know this, you have to understand what is your task in hand. Okay, so we direct your method through the task in hand. The definition of a task in hand is your current focus of attention. And for racing drivers, we can refine this further to whatever you need to be doing now to maximize your performance. So that actually identifies it very quickly. Your task is, what do you need to be doing now to maximize your performance? As tasks are so clearly critical to performance, it's of vital importance that they are clearly defined by you. You need to know exactly what each and every task is over a weekend or over a test day or over a session, how it needs to be performed, and when you need to be focused on it. Another way of describing this is, what do you need to be 100% present for? In motor racing, we have many tasks to perform. It's a really complicated sport. If you are a 100 meters runner, you've got to, well, turn up, warm up, get in the blocks, you've got to start, you transition, and you've got to run like hell, and dip for the whatever they call it, not the flag. And that's the blue ribbon of athletics. Motor racing, it is immensely complicated what we have to do. So there are going to be many, many more tasks at various times that you have to be aware of. So if we just sort of look at a qualifying session, okay, what tasks could be involved here? And remember, the simpler we can keep it, the easier it is for our mind to stay on that task, okay? So let's just look at it. Let's just take qualifying from an hour out before you go out onto the track. So this is out of the car to start with. So part of that could be you start off with speaking to your engineer so that you're clear and you just run over what the strategy is going to be. Maybe track conditions are changed in the interim. And are there any sort of final changes that you need to be aware of? That is a task. You need to make sure that you're clear on what you're going to do when you go out onto the track in terms of what your engineer or your mechanic or your team wants you to do. Very clear task. Then for you as a driver, you need to be absolutely sure what your driving plan is. Go back through your notes, look at your track notes. Also, you need to just review what your what ifs are. What if it doesn't, if things happen that are not part of that plan, they need to be reviewed as well. So you now know what the team wants you to do, what you need to be doing as a driver. And then for most of our drivers, they then will be undertaking their pre-performance routine. And that will be sort of physical warm-up of the body and activation of the mind as well. And that also helps keep you focused on something rather than the mind sort of rattling off into, am I going to be able to do this, or he or she's looking quick today. It gives you something to start to narrow your focus behind. So just 3 things, okay? Then, in terms of being in the car, once you get into your car, you might want to review your goal. Why am I here? What do I want to achieve? Number of drivers will visualize a lap, and then after that, if they've been practicing their mindfulness, they will keep their mind focused on their breathing, just keeping their mind centered. That's a very important task while we're waiting in the car. Okay. Then you're out on track. First lap task to perform: get heat into your brakes and your tires. Find space, and then execute the last corner well. Doesn't mean we want to try and be clever and try and take an extra 5 miles an hour onto the straight. No, let's not make a mistake. Let's just be really accurate so we start the first flying lap really well. Okay. Again, simple 3 tasks, and you can put all of your effort into that. Okay. And then subsequent laps, nothing more complicated than focusing on delivering your method and keeping your attention there. And your method in that case might just be as simple, the most simple default method or task could be to make every single apex you can in that qualifying run. Okay, so that's a sort of example of tasks that you need to perform and understand clearly before you go out in qualifying. If we understand those clearly, we're much less likely to have the mind playing tricks with us and presenting us with distracting thoughts. So, very important with these tasks, as I said to you, is keeping it simple, because there are many dangers of multitasking. Okay, people talk about that being a sort of amazing skill to have, but actually, if you research it, multitasking is something you don't want to be involved in it. As the definition of a task in hand is your current focus of attention in the singular, it's important that you don't try and focus on more than one thing at a time. Research has shown that our brains are not nearly as good at handling multiple tasks as we like to think they are. In fact, some researchers suggest that multitasking can actually reduce productivity in everyday life. So what can it do to us in motor racing? By as much as 40%. So it's important to think about what effect this could have when you go out on track, if you allow yourself to multitask. And a sort of multitask, what I'm talking about here is we're going out with the intention of making every apex, and actually we're getting ourselves distracted by other cars around us, or doubts about our performance, or suddenly trying some new technique. The challenge with multitasking is it requires you to shift your attention, and that's the key word we're going to come back to in a second, and focus from one thing to the next, so nothing gets your full attention. And it makes it difficult to tune out distractions. And this can cause anxiety, mental blocks, and can impair your cognitive ability, your thinking ability. So let's look at attention. You put your attention into your task in hand. Okay? Attention is your ability to keep your mind on a particular task. It's the energy. Your attention is sort of almost the energy and the focus behind that drives that task or the execution of that task. It can also be called focus and concentration. And this can be quantified with the potential of 100% of attention, focus, or concentration, call it what you want. The key thing is it is finite. Driving a racing car is a very complex mental exercise where lap times are timed to within thousandths of a second, and drivers work in very fine margins, on a knife edge of grip at the outer edges of the friction circle. So if we take two drivers of equal skill and experience, and one of those drivers is able to focus 100% on their task in hand when qualifying, and the other just has a niggling 1% thought running through their head. They had a bad free practice on Friday, and they want it really, can I do that? It's just sort of just niggling away in the background. And they haven't been able to eliminate doubts about their ability to perform. Who in this case is going to be quickest when we're timing to 1,000ths of a second? That's obvious. It's going to be the guy who's using 100% of their attention to the task in hand will have the advantage in that situation. The more clear focus you can apply to a particular task, the better you're going to be at it. This is of immense importance for us to understand. Knowing that your skill and experience is fixed when you get in your car to qualify, the only variable. So remember, when you get in the car, you cannot suddenly become more skillful than you are, and you absolutely can't become more experienced in that moment. The only variable that you can control is the quality of your attention on the task in hand, whatever that might be. Obviously, you're going out on track, it's probably going to be your method, okay, your B game, okay? So in terms of attention, we can have relevant and irrelevant focuses of attention. When on track, there are a number of tasks and thoughts that a driver can choose to focus on. Some of them are highly relevant, and others are highly irrelevant and can damage performance. So it's really important that for you as an individual, you understand what these are. For example, focusing on your vision or the next apex as you approach a corner is very important to attend to. That's a very important task, should be a very important part of your method and a very important part of your B game. Whereas lingering thoughts about lingering thoughts about how your teammate is doing and he might be catching you is completely irrelevant to the successful execution of the next corner. And let's look at the effect of intention on attention, okay, where we are directing our mind. And another word for intention could be arousal, okay? So where intention or arousal increases, a driver's attention, I'm getting myself confused here, will begin to narrow. So as intention increases, a driver's attention will begin to narrow, okay? And I'm going to give you an example here. A perfect example of this is where, and most of you will be familiar with this, if you're circuit drivers anyway. A perfect example of this is where a driver focuses on catching a car in front of them. So you go out of the pits and you see in front of you another driver sort of 100 yards up the road from you. And your intention is to catch the other car, okay? And the intention to catch the other car brings focus to what you're doing. And this narrows your attention to just catching the car, to the complete exclusion of everything else. Critically, you're not thinking how to catch the other car. But as you start to catch the other car, this intention or arousal raises further. And obviously, because we can see we're catching, motivation increases. And this further narrows down our attention. And when you reach what could be called your optimal attention, you're really just focusing on the relevant task, and you're just ignoring the irrelevant ones. You're just really just focusing on catching, not how to do it, when to do it, what technique to use. You're just locked in on catching that car. And then you get to the point where you're not thinking of anything. You're just doing. And critically, this is the beginning of the A game. So once your intention and your focus and attention start to narrow to the point where you're not thinking in any way how to drive the car, this is the beginnings of you touching the zone, touching your A game. Okay. So after all that, let's just recap to where I was talking about the scenario of professional drivers being able to access their B game under pressure. So to go back to our earlier scenario of how a professional driver has the ability to deliver their B game under pressure, thereby salvaging a second row qualifying position when their A game is not functioning. How do they do it? Okay, and there's 4 points here. The first thing is they understand what is happening and accept that they're not always going to be on their A game. And this is through, if they've had no training in this or no talks on it or anything like that, they've learned through bitter experience that they're not always going to be on their A game. Okay. Secondly, they hopefully understand their mind. They stay mindful. And as a result of staying mindful, they don't trigger their fight and flight instinct. So the decisions they make are not going to be emotional, they're going to be logically driven. Thirdly, they know and trust their method. And again, remember, your method and your B game are absolutely interchangeable. They've trained it and delivered it over and over again under pressure. They know it's there. And finally, they keep their focus and intention on the most relevant task in hand at that time, whether they're inside the car or outside of the car. And so finally, it's important to remember that you have no God-given right to your A or B game. You've got no God-given right to the ability to perform under pressure, no God-given right to pole positions, wins, or perfect weekends. You only get these things through hard-won self-knowledge and experience, unrelenting hard work, unrelenting practice, mental grit, and applying your B game, no matter the pressure you face. And on this journey of training and discovery that you go about, enjoy yourself, because and take pride in the fact that you are learning how to grind out performances in a way that your competitors can't. That's it.
Thank you so much, John. That was really insightful to listen in on behind the scenes there. Has anybody got any questions? If so, we'll give you 30 seconds or so to pop in those in the Q&A box. So I'll just open that up. No questions so far. I think you've stunned everybody, John.
Okay, I forgot my last slide, but there we go. But it's, it is being able to perform under pressure. It is, in essence, very simple, but it needs to be backed up by a lot of knowledge and a lot of practice to be able to do that. And, professional drivers, they over the years, especially guys who start karting at 6-7 years old, they have years and years and years of experience that builds this knowledge. But what we're trying to do here is, how do drivers come into the sport, new license holders, from your point of view, Kate, how do they quickly learn the skills that experiences has been built up by the other drivers? So this is the whole idea behind this, is to shortcut that learning.
Let's just see. Okay, I don't think, we've just got one question that popped up. This certainly relates to adults. Any specific advice for young drivers? I'm a father of a 9-year-old karting driver.
Okay, I think that's I think for karters, the most important thing is that they're going karting and enjoying it. I know that doesn't sound a very bold answer to your question. I think how old is the driver? 9.
9, yeah.
9 years old. And obviously it depends on how long they've been karting for as well. But I always think that the most important thing for drivers of that age, probably until they get to 11 and 12, is to make sure that it's foremost, it's enjoyable. Because we don't want to beat out the enthusiasm of drivers by making of young karters by making outcomes so important. And why I was asking about experiences, in karting we get drivers of very vastly different experience, vastly different budgets, etc. And so you're not playing on a level playing field. So so the first part is to make sure you're enjoying it. I think the second thing is to make sure when they are enjoying it, that's the time to introduce new things and to introduce very, very simple concepts to them. So you could water a lot of this down for them. It's not a good time to be, when things are difficult and they're not enjoying it, that is not the time to be introducing new ideas or new concepts. We have to, I believe we've got to be really, really careful with kids of that age to keep their enthusiasm, and they're doing it for the right reasons. We want to, it's that point where they want to know more. Maybe, they've been going through some difficult weekends, and actually they might say to you, I'm really struggling. That certainly could be a point, but where you can start to introduce very simple complex concepts, but not on weekends when they've gone when it hasn't been good, and everyone's a little bit down on them. No one's going to be listening at that point. So you have to be ever so careful with kids, and you've got to make it fun, and you've got to be firing their enthusiasm, and when they want to know more, then you've got the perfect opportunity to tell them all. That's not a very long-winded answer, sorry.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. That's great. There's another question that's come up from James, and it says, I presume that just as attention and motivation increase as you catch a car, then conversely, if the car in front begins to build a gap to you, motivation and attention can drop away. And how is that dealt with?
Okay. Yeah. And the other situation there is that you become too focused on catching the other car, and then it starts not to happen, and you'll focus on one particular skill to the exclusion of others, like braking. That's what we always revert to, and we'll start to overdrive. When a car in front, so my example was where we're catching a car and attention's building, etc. A very familiar thing. It's very, very different where you're following a car and it starts to pull away, because we don't have any God-given right to be as talented to the car as the driver in front, and our car might be on different tires, might have a different setup. The whole idea of knowing our method, our B game, is to know where our skill level is, what we're capable of doing, and what is our technique. And when we need to recognize when we're stepping beyond that. And so if you see a car pulling away from you and you are delivering your B game the best that you can, you stay there and you accept that car has to pull away from you, because the only alternative there is you try harder, you try outside of your method, your skill level. And what's going to happen? Because it's unpracticed, you're going to make mistakes. So it's a very, very different situation to catching a car that's slower than you. Okay, when you're catching a car that's slower than you, you're using all of your B game, at its optimum at the outside of its flight envelope. And when a car's getting away from you, you have to continue to do the same as that. If you want to perform optimally, you have to stay there and you have to accept it. As I think I talked about in the first talk, on the grid, there's 30 cars. Say if you're in a, let's say, BTCC or something like that, you're not all on the same pace. And what we've got to do is deliver all of the time our B game, the best that we can at that point. Hopefully that answers it.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. We haven't got any other questions come in, but obviously if anybody's got any questions that spring to mind afterwards, I'm sure that John won't mind answering. We have actually just had one more pop up. Have you got time for one more, John?
Yeah, no problem.
So the question is, do we need to make a distinction between pro drivers and amateurs? And does what we discussed tonight apply to amateur drivers in exactly the same way?
I think that's a very good question. And we have at iZone, we have a number of drivers within our group going from sort of 60-year-old karters all the way up to 63 years old, I think is the oldest driver we have. And the basic principles are exactly the same for professional drivers as they are for amateur drivers. Everything that we do is going to be driven by what your goal is. Okay, so that is that defines how much work and how much attention you put into your skills. And also, if you're an amateur driver, you probably got a profession as well. And so how I talk to drivers who have professions or careers or jobs as well, you've got a sliver of time every day or every week or sometime at the weekends. And it's so important for you, you would have your training goals, and you absolutely can only tackle one snake at a time. Okay, and make sure that you're tackling, as I was saying, the biggest snake that you can get hold of at that time, whatever is your biggest opportunity, biggest weakness. But there is no harm sitting at home and at night before you go to bed and learning about the skills involved. It's your challenge is the only difference between an amateur and a professional is the amount of time that they have to put into their training.
Brilliant, thank you. Looks like that's all of the questions that have come in. So I think we'll call it a day there. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I hope you found it useful. If you enjoyed this session and would like to see more from iZone, then go and visit their website. They've got loads of different packages of various different training topics that might be of interest. We also have some further webinars, sort of one more before Christmas and a couple after Christmas. And if you'd like to join us for any of those, you can head to the Motorsport UK website to sign up. So I think otherwise, thanks again and enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody.